The story begins with something deceptively ordinary, not war, not politics, but what's sitting in your kitchen. A common ingredient, used every day without a second thought, suddenly becomes the center of a much bigger story. What makes it powerful is not its rarity, but its invisibility. It has always been there, always available, always cheap. And that's exactly why nobody paid attention to it. Until now. At the center of this shift is Mark Carney, who made a move that didn't look dramatic on the surface. There were no loud announcements, no aggressive threats, no immediate headlines signaling conflict. Instead, it came quietly, disguised as routine policy. But beneath that calm exterior was a strategic decision that reshaped a critical supply chain. And before we break this down further, subscribe to Canada Policy for clear, in-depth analysis on the moments shaping Canada's future. The key idea is dependency.
Nobody in the White House was watching canola oil. Nobody in the administration had classified it as a strategic vulnerability. And by the time anyone in Washington understood what Carney had done, the contracts were signed, the supply had been redirected, and the American snack industry was already scrambling to answer a question it had never once considered. Where does our oil come from? Let's take you through exactly what happened, because the speed of this move is what made it devastating. Carney's announcement came without warning. No diplomatic preview, no leaked signals, no back-channel hints to Washington. It arrived as a formal policy declaration during a midweek economic briefing in Ottawa that was not on the radar of any American trade monitoring team because the subject line, domestic agricultural processing investment, read like routine infrastructure policy. The announcement contained 4 specific actions, all enacted simultaneously with the declaration. First, an immediate 25% reduction in canola oil export allocations to the United States, effective within 14 days. Second, a $512 million federal investment in Canadian canola crushing and refining capacity designed to process raw canola seed into finished oil products domestically rather than exporting raw seed
for decades. The American food system has relied heavily on canola oil, an ingredient found in snacks, fast food, packaged meals, and countless everyday products. It's so deeply embedded in the system that it has become invisible. Not because it's unimportant, but because it's always been there.
And the conduct of trading partners. The American response was chaos. Reports emerged within hours that Trump's trade team received the announcement via news alert, not through diplomatic channels, and that the initial reaction in the West Wing was confusion rather than fury. One senior trade advisor reportedly asked the question that revealed the depth of the intelligence failure. How dependent are we on Canadian canola? The answer, when it arrived from the USDA 45 minutes later, was the kind of number that makes rooms go quiet. Canada supplies over 75% of America's canola oil imports, which in turn represent the single largest source of cooking oil used in American food manufacturing. That number wasn't classified. It wasn't buried in obscure trade data. It was publicly available in the USDA's own commodity reports, published annually, accessible to anyone who looked. Nobody had looked, because canola oil had always been there, affordable, abundant, reliable. And things that have always been there stop registering as vulnerabilities. They become background, and then someone turns off the background. But before we explain the full scope of what Carney's move means for the American food industry, we need to tell you something about canola oil that will change the way you read every food label.
Reliable
for the rest
systems
of your life.
often disappear into the background, and once they do, they stop being questioned. This is where the real story begins. The dependency on canola oil was never hidden. In fact, it was printed on labels, documented in public reports, and present in everyday life.
From oil and low acid. Canola, Canada oil, low acid. The product was developed by researchers at the University of Manitoba, who bred a new variety of rapeseed plant, specifically designed to produce an oil that was low in uric acid and safe for human consumption at industrial scale. They named it after their country because it was a Canadian invention, a Canadian product developed with Canadian research funding, grown on Canadian farms, processed in Canadian facilities, and marketed to the world as a Canadian achievement. Americans have been reading the word Canada on every snack label in their kitchen for over 40 years, and never once registered what it meant. Go to your kitchen right now. Pick up any bag of chips. Pick up any box of cookies or crackers. Pick up any bottle of cooking spray. any jar of mayonnaise, any frozen meal. Read the ingredient list. You will find canola oil. You will find it in Lay's potato chips and Ritz crackers and Oreos and Pringles and Pop-Tarts and Cheez-Its and Doritos and Nature Valley granola bars and Goldfish crackers and hundreds of other products that Americans eat every day without thinking. And every time you read the word canola, you are reading the word Canada. Canola oil and its fryers. McDonald's, KFC, Chick-fil-A, Burger King, Wendy's, Popeyes, Five Guys, Taco Bell. It is the default cooking oil in commercial restaurant kitchens from coast to coast because it has a neutral flavor, a high smoke point, and a cost structure that no alternative oil matches at the volumes commercial
But because
food
it was
service
taken for
requires.
granted, it was never treated as a vulnerability. And that's what made it powerful. Carney's move didn't involve cutting supply completely. Instead, it focused on redirecting it. By reducing exports, increasing domestic processing, and securing long-term agreements with other countries, Canada shifted control over where its canola oil flows. This wasn't about creating a visible shortage, it was about quietly tightening availability in key areas while strengthening relationships elsewhere.
Reality that would take a decade and tens of billions of dollars in agricultural investment to even begin to unwind. Now let's explain exactly what Carney did, because the move was designed to be impossible to reverse before anyone understood it was happening. The 25% export reduction was the visible headline, but the real weapon was the $512 million investment in domestic Canadian crushing capacity. Canada has historically exported a significant portion of its canola as raw seed, unprocessed, shipped to American and international crushing facilities that extract the oil and sell it to food manufacturers. Carney's investment redirected that model. Instead of exporting raw seed for Americans to process, Canada would now process the seed domestically, producing finished canola oil in Canadian facilities and sell the finished product directly to global buyers on preferential terms. The effect was to move Canada up the value chain, from exporting a raw commodity to exporting a finished product, while simultaneously cutting American processors out of the supply chain entirely. The preferential supply agreements compounded the impact exponentially. The EU agreement alone committed 1.3 million metric tons of Canadian canola oil annually, roughly 30% of Canada's total exportable production to European food manufacturers at prices 7 to 11% below current market
The reaction revealed
rates.
how unprepared the system was. Instead of immediate pushback, there was confusion. The focus had been on obvious pressure points like energy, tariffs, and manufacturing, while something far more fundamental went unnoticed. This highlights a critical insight. The most important parts of a system are often the least visible.
The scope of the redirection, the math was already catastrophic. The available supply of canola oil on the open market, the supply that American buyers had always purchased without contracts because it had always been available, had been reduced by over 40%. Not because Canada stopped producing canola, but because Canada redirected it to buyers who signed contracts, paid preferential rates, and secured their supply before America knew it needed securing. When reporters asked Carney about the canola move at a press conference in Ottawa the following day, with the American snack industry already in emergency mode, and Trump's trade team still assembling its first comprehensive briefing on canola dependency, Carney delivered 10 words that will define this chapter of the trade confrontation. A Globe and Mail reporter asked, "Prime Minister, American food manufacturers are calling this an act of economic warfare. What is your response?" Carney paused. He looked at the reporter with an expression that combined the precision of a central banker with the calm of a man who has been holding a winning hand and has finally decided to show it. And he said, "The label
As the
always
effects
said
spread,
Canada."
they moved through the system in layers. Manufacturers felt it first, then distributors, then retailers, and eventually consumers. This is how large economic shifts actually impact people. Not through sudden shocks, but through gradual changes. Prices increase, supply becomes less stable, and small adjustments begin to accumulate.
Printed on every food label in the country, was publicly documented in the USDA's own reports, and was literally named after the country that supplies it. You cannot claim you were prepared when the warning was written in the product's own name. You cannot claim strategic patience when your trade team was Googling canola oil supply chain while the Canadian Prime Minister was giving press conferences. The consequences hit the American snack industry before the White House had finished assembling its first response. Canola oil futures spiked 19% in the first week after the announcement. the largest single-week increase in oilseed markets since the Ukraine conflict disrupted global sunflower oil supply. Frito-Lay, the subsidiary of PepsiCo that produces Lay's, Doritos, Cheetos, Tostitos, and Ruffles, issued an emergency supply chain review and warned investors of material input cost increases that will require pricing adjustments across our North American snack portfolio. Mondelez International, the parent company of Oreo, Ritz, Chips Ahoy, Triscuit, and Wheat Thins, filed a force majeure notice with 3 of its canola oil suppliers and announced it was evaluating all alternative oil sources, language that industry analysts recognized as an admission that no adequate alternative currently existed.
The deeper lesson is about how power works in modern systems. It's no longer just about size or scale, it's about precision, understanding where the real leverage points are and acting on them. By identifying an overlooked dependency, Canada was able to exert influence far beyond what traditional measures of power would suggest.
The previous Canadian precision strike had produced. Fury directed not at Canada but at the White House, concentrated in exactly the industries, states, and voter demographics the administration could least afford to lose. The Snack Food Association, representing over 400 manufacturers, issued a statement that was 1 sentence longer than necessary, and that final sentence contained the entire political indictment. We urge the administration to resolve the trade dispute that has created this crisis before it destroys the industry that feeds America's families. The trade dispute that created this crisis, not Canada's move. The trade dispute. The administration's trade dispute. Republican members of Congress from agricultural and food manufacturing states began issuing statements demanding an immediate reassessment of trade strategies that put American food security at risk, language that any voter could read as the president's trade war is making your snacks more expensive. The American Farm Bureau Federation published data showing that American canola farmers, yes, America grows canola too, primarily in North Dakota, Montana, and Minnesota, were being devastated by the global price restructuring. Because Canadian canola was now flowing to higher-paying international buyers, while American farmers faced a collapsing domestic processing infrastructure that could no longer access affordable raw materials.
Another key theme is visibility. Just because something is in plain sight doesn't mean it's understood. The word canola itself points directly to its origin, yet its significance was largely ignored.
On the strategic agricultural investment model. The European Commission published a working paper within 10 days citing the canola move as evidence that asymmetric trade strategies targeting invisible supply chain dependencies represent the most significant evolution in economic statecraft since the invention of targeted sanctions. Brazil's agricultural minister said publicly that his country was evaluating which agricultural exports constitute strategic leverage that has been undervalued in trade negotiations. Language that every trade analyst in Washington recognized as a signal that the Carney doctrine was spreading. Canada had not just made a move against the United States. It had demonstrated to every mid-sized agricultural exporter in the world that the ingredients hiding in plain sight on American food labels were potential leverage points waiting to be activated. The consumer reaction was unlike anything the previous rounds of the trade confrontation had produced, because the canola crisis came with a built-in engagement mechanism that no communication strategist could have designed better. Within 72 hours of Carney's quote going viral, Check Your Labels became a social media phenomenon that crossed every demographic, every political affiliation, and every age group. Millions of Americans walked to their kitchens, picked up the snacks they had been eating their entire lives, and read the ingredient list for the first time, like 19%. Every major snack manufacturer in America issued supply chain warnings. Fast food chains projected menu price increases of 6 to 14%. Franchise operators calculated whether their businesses could survive. Trump was caught completely off guard because nobody in Washington was monitoring an ingredient that was printed on every food label in the country and was literally named after the country that makes it. And Carney stood at a podium in Ottawa and said 10 words that are now on the front page of every major newspaper in the world. The label always said Canada. Nobody in Washington reads labels. The question that should follow every American from the grocery store to the ballot box, from the snack aisle to the voting booth is this: how many other dependencies are hiding in plain sight? Printed on labels, embedded in supply chains named after the countries that control them, visible to anyone who bothered to look, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for the day that always available becomes no longer available, and the country that never read the label discovers what it always said. Trump built a trade strategy around the assumption that economic size is economic security, that the largest economy can always absorb the most pain, impose the most pressure, and outlast any
This
smaller
reflects a broader
adversary.
issue in complex systems. Information can be available without being recognized as important. This moment also signals a shift in strategy. Instead of direct confrontation, influence is increasingly exercised through subtle, targeted moves. Looking ahead, the story raises an important question. What else is being overlooked? If something as fundamental as a widely used ingredient can go unnoticed as a strategic vulnerability, it suggests there may be other dependencies hiding in plain sight. These could exist across industries, waiting to be recognized and potentially leveraged. The takeaway is simple but powerful. What you don't notice can still shape your reality. And in a world where small shifts can have wide-reaching effects, paying attention to what seems ordinary might be more important than ever.
It was never a secret. It was never hidden. It was the most visible dependency in the history of global trade, and nobody in Washington ever read it. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.